35, 40 minutes for each
Perfect.
session. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We are resuming our sessions of our International Kant Colloquium, and we are very glad to announce now that we're going to be receiving for our first session Professors Luigi Caranti and Diana Piroli from the University of Catania in Sicily. They're going to be giving their talk on climate change and natural beauty, Kant's moderate biocentrism. So Luigi and Diana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Nitamar, and also the other organizers for having us here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I will share with you a PowerPoint that Luigi, Professor Carant, and I have organized. So please let me know if you can see it. Yes? Perfect. So this is a paper that we are working at the moment for a book on Kant. And it's a draft, so we will be very happy with your comments and with your thoughts about it. The summary of our presentation is basically divided in three parts. I will do the first one, which is the introduction to the problem, what we want to address. In the second and third one, Professor Luigi Caranti, who is the real Kantian scholar here in this in this partnership, we will present for you the greening Kant and then our proposal on the moderate biocentrism. So let's go very quickly on the first part. I am a political philosopher working on climate justice, so I called Professor Luigi Caranti to help me to see what a Kantian perspective could do with this problem that we want to address. Basically, we start our presentation by taking a look at a particular phenomenon, which is the green transition. The green transition is a big process of change from an economic system based on fossil fuel to a sustainable one. It's not just a process of a big structural change in the economic system of production, but also in consumption and also of people's personal daily habits. So our point is people, ordinary people here, often perceive this profound transformation in our economy and daily life requested by the green transition as somehow as over-demanding tasks. So we are not trying to capture the people who are climate denialists, but we are trying to address the case of many people and reasonable, decent and reasonable people that not freely endorse those changes because they can perceive this as over-demanding. So there is an urgent problem of mobilizing the right intellectual resources, not only to convince those people that change their lifestyles, their daily acts is required by justice, but also to motivate them to do so. So we ask, but why is it so hard to convince and motivate citizens to act environmentally better? Well, people who are perceived themselves to be disadvantaged in highly unequal societies often believe, with some reasons, that they are paying too much for carbon emissions mitigation. For example, using the famous Nancy Fraser's vocabulary, we refer to it as the redistributive burdens associated with the green transition. But also people might, and they often do, resist to coercive transformation of their non-sustainable lifestyles independently of their economic considerations. So think of the resistance against banning flights when trains are available, or the resistance against the state-funded promotion of green values in the schools. Well, using Fraser vocabulary, we can refer to it as somehow as cultural burdens implied in the green transitions. Especially in liberal democracies, this problem is very particular acute. Why? Because citizens often think that the green policies can somehow clash with their constitutional rights and liberties. In particular, they might perceive the green transitions as something that can violate not just their economic rights and liberties, but also possibly their rights and liberties to shape by themselves their lifestyles and conceptions of a good life without institutional external interferences. So how the current literature in climate justice have been addressing this problem? On the one hand, some authors believe that the green transition can occur without a change of people's lifestyles and conceptions of a good life. For example, this is the case of the Promethean utopia described by Professor Darrell Mollendorf. On the other hand, some authors endorse that the green transition can effectively occur without external promotion and even imposition of a changes lifestyles, citizens' lifestyles. And for the reasons it's necessary to impose some kind of green comprehensive doctrine on liberal democratic citizens. That's, for example, some kind of radical ecofeminist theories, such as described by Professor Val Plumwood. Well, our proposal is that changes in sustainable conduct and lifestyles are necessary. However, they do not entail the adoption of a particular comprehensive doctrine, but they must be accompanied by citizens' convinced endorsement rather than institutional coercion alone. So, just to finish the first part, we bring here the prominent political philosopher John Rawls, because according to him, constitutional liberal democracies must be able to address two distinct, however, complementing questions. First, as probably you might know, the question of justice, but simply what are the normative criteria and principles that political institutions must respect when designing, implementing climate policies that have such a strong impact on citizens' lives. But also we have, according to Rawls, the second question, and it's the question of stability. That is, how can political institutions help to promote green habits and help citizens to freely endorse them over a lifetime? So once we take seriously Rawls' indications, then a legitimate process of green transitions must be able to address those questions and then move into steps. First, to address the question of justice, we must prove that green policies are not only compatible, but also required by liberal democratic values. And the second, to address the question of stability, we must find arguments to convince people to respect green policies, not mere as modus vivendi, but increase the chances of a full-hearted and hence more stable adherence to the green policies. So that's the introduction of the problem, and now I will let the floor to Professor Luigi Caran so he can proceed.
Okay, thank you very much, Diana, and again, thank you very much for giving us the chance to discuss this still rather confused and unorderly ideas. We are making progress, but not very fast. That's mainly my fault. Okay, so what Kantian resources can be mobilized in order to answer the question of justice and the question of stability that Diana just mentioned? Many people think pretty much none. Leave Kant outside of this debate because Kant is not the right starting point if you want to prove that green policies are just, and most importantly, if you want to mobilize people, I mean, to show that, if you want to show that there are reasonable grounds for expecting people to adhere to obligations, whether legal or ethical, towards the green transition. Why is that? Why can be a bad starting point? Well, it's an anthropocentric moral theory, which is clearly a wrong point, in the sense that, if anything, Kant has a logocentric moral theory, that is, the source of value is rationality, not humanity. Humanity only to the extent in which it endorses rationality, or only to the extent in which human beings are rational. Second, but even if you don't make the mistake of calling an anthropocentric moral theory, it's still a logocentric moral theory, which lives outside biocentrism, that is, doesn't make nature the center of value, one of the centers of value, and it looks like it's just an instrument, has only an instrumental value. Second, Kant doesn't seem to be the good starting point to address conflicts of duties. And with the green transition, we are full of conflicts of duty. Even people who like the green transition, like Darren Mullendorf, are fairly aware that, at least moving towards a zero emission policy may clash with the attempt of many developing countries to electrify themselves and therefore to consume more energy, which of course conflicts with green goals. Third, maybe since not dying out of extinction seems to be something that we should be self-interested independently of what morality says, Kant may not be a good starting point because, strictly speaking, the goal of being green is heteronymous. It's not even, it's not even dictated by morality, it's dictated by prudential reason. Fourth, the usual story that Kant is moral theory is individualistic, formal, abstract. And so the result seems to, is that very few people, but that's not true. Not everybody thought that Kant could be mobilized in favor of finding an answer to the question of justice and to the question of stability. Okay, next slide, Diana.
Sorry.
Okay, these are exception to what I just said. I mean, there are many people who worked on this with very different ideas, often contradictory with one another. I'm not going to say anything about this because I don't have time and I want to save time for the discussion. So next slide. Well, of course, all these people, including us, are trying to do pretty much this 4 points, are trying to address, to reach some results about each of these 4 points. You have to refute the idea that green policies violate individual basic rights, as some people might think, as Diana showed before. You have to refute the idea that green-inspired restriction of our freedom is against liberal democratic and republican values, because, of course, in a Rawlsian spirit, we are not speaking from the perspective of eternity, but we are mainly, primarily at least, addressing liberal democracies. You have to refute the idea that the promotion of green policies via public money and institutional initiative is favoring or is biased in favor of one lifestyle over others. So if you are a vegan, you are unjustly advantaged by this green transition. And you have to diffuse the argument, not refute the argument of the poor who say, well, poor or the worst off, who say, well, wait a minute, okay, I get the necessity of the green transition, but the burdens of this is not fairly shared because, what I have to pay from the condition in which I am is incomparably higher than what you, rich guy, have to pay for the same goal. Okay, so next. Okay, we skip this one altogether. Well, what about the question of justice? Let's start with what Kant could do to help us with the question of justice. So, are we really violating basic individual rights, basic individual liberties when we impose through a legal obligation certain change in the lifestyles of people, certain, burdens for the sake of reaching or mitigating climate change? Well, of course, no. And it's good that Kant has a very straightforward answer to that, because, of course, for him, the question of justice is a question of coexistence of individual spheres of freedom, as opposed to, having an hierarchy of values. I mean, is eating meat, red meat, more important than, the well-being or future generations about which you don't know much, and so on and so forth. So it's not a clash of comprehensive doctrines, unless you want to say that the commitment to the respect of freedom, I mean, is the fundamental value. But in this sense, yes, you could say that it's as Rawls himself thought, that Kant is a comprehensive liberal. But other than that, there is no commitment to, one lifestyle over another. There is only a big constraint on your lifestyle, that you're not allowed to choose a lifestyle that diminishes the sphere of freedom of another person, or makes their spheres of freedom smaller than what is your sphere of freedom. So it's easy, right, from this perspective, to understand that eating excessive amount of beef or flying private jets may be just an infringement on other people's freedom. Not, we will see what people are we talking about in a moment. So your lifestyle simply infringes on my basic right to an equal chance to exercise my freedom. Therefore, all this fuss about, if you impose green legal obligations, you are violating my basic rights. Actually, the other way around. If you don't impose legal obligations in order to mitigate climate change, you are violating the spheres of freedom of somebody. Next slide, and we see who is this somebody. Okay, let's look at the famous universal principle of right. Any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law, or if on its maxim the freedom of choice of each can coexist with everyone's freedom in accordance with the universal law. So who is everyone here? Well, of course, everyone is not just the present generation, right? So the universal principle of right was never meant to have a validity that finishes with the end of the current generation. It includes each and every human being, in fact, each and every rational being, of which human beings are just a subset. And therefore, and that's the important point to notice here, everyone here includes future generation. So if we think about the contrast between eating too much red meat today and the possible infringement of the freedom of someone else, this someone else must include everyone from a Kantian perspective, including future generations. So it's the same point that my friend Sandro Ferrara and Frank Michelman make in a different context in this book that came out a couple of years ago, when they talk about the people. Who is the people? We the people, right? As in the American Constitution. We the people cannot be the generation of Washington only. It has to include also the generation of Americans to come. And therefore, only populists may think that the people of a nation coincide with the electorate of a certain, electoral round. But of course, I mean, good old Kant never thought that this could be the case. Next slide. Okay, so this is the end of what I have to say about the question of justice. It seems to me quite straightforward that Kant is an excellent starting point to address the issue of justice, so to ground the legal obligation in favor of the green transition, no matter what the costs are in terms of changing your lifestyle and what have you, because, nothing could overcome the protection of the equal sphere of freedom for each and every human being existing or yet to exist. But now we have to move to the more difficult question of the existence of an ethical obligation, the possible existence of an ethical obligation in favor of the green transition, and then to the even more difficult question of what does Kant has to say, what Kant can say in order to make the compliance with ethical or legal obligation in favor of the transition something that people could be motivated for. Okay, so as a way of moving towards this ethical / motivation and motivational dimensions of our discussion, of course, let's remember that for Kant, if laws are just, and if people live under just laws, this cannot fail to have an effect, a good positive consequence on the way in which they think, on their morality, level of morality. So this important thought that you find in Perpetual Peace and elsewhere, in which Kant says quite vocally that it's not the case that you can expect good constitutions from good people, but the other way around. You can expect good people from good constitutions. So you start with making good laws. You have generation of citizens living under these good laws, and the idea is that this is going to improve their morality. That's why it's an intermezzo. That's why it's a point that brings us from law to ethics. Law, the good laws at least, just laws, determines also the ethical disposition of people. Okay, next slide. Now let's go more directly to the foundation of an ethical duty. Well, is it also an ethical duty? Well, first of all, in a certain sense, if there is a legal obligation, it's an ethical obligation for Kant that you respect the legal obligation. And this, of course, also creates a little bit of problem when the legal obligation is clearly unjust. As you know, you have no right to rebel, and which probably also includes no ethical permission to rebel against even unjust governments and so on and so forth. But leaving that aside, it's easy to ground an ethical duty in favor of green goals from a Kantian perspective, even if Kant has a logocentric approach, and direct consideration is due only to rational beings and not to nature, it is still true that preserving a healthy and livable environment is a condition of the exercise of other people's freedom, including the development of their talents and so on and so forth. So it may not be a direct ethical duty in favor of the green transition, but certainly there is an indirect ethical duty that pushes in that direction. And this is a point that Altman, not the Sylvia that we have with us, makes in this kind of overarching, rather complete account of what Kant can be, how Kant could be mobilized in an indirect manner in this chapter of 2011. Next slide. Okay, well, I think I'm going to skip this because it's a little bit more about what other people have said in order to go a little bit beyond this merely indirect ethical duty. So, nature, who cares? But to the extent in which nature is important for the development of human beings, which are the only source of nature, then source of value, then of course we have an ethical obligation to preserve nature. I'm not going to say anything about what Wood says, what Kosgard said, even because I don't very much agree with them. And therefore, I'll skip. If you want, I go back in discussion. So next slide. Okay. So where are we? We answered the question of justice. We answered the ethical question. The question about the existence of an ethical obligation in favor of the green transition. But we haven't said much about the motivational issue, which was, at the center of our concerns, as you remember. Now, the first thing I'd like to say about this is that if we talk about motivation, one good thing that you can mobilize from a Kantian perspective is that an ethical obligation, I mean, if the moral law tells you what to do, this is not an heteronymous command that someone else imposes on you, because the moral law comes from your own reason in a Kantian scenario, right? So the fact that ethical obligations are always self-imposed, not legal ones, but ethical obligations are self-imposed because it's ultimately your pure practical reason that impose them on you. Of course, you have to be motivated to some extent, unless you are schizophrenic, because the motivation is coming from inside, so to speak. Now, sometimes we make exception. I mean, this motivation is not strong enough. I don't know what is your story about the possibility of being immoral in a Kantian scenario, but we are radically evil and so on and so forth. But at least, ethical duties are not conventions. Ethical duties do not come from outside. They don't come from the tradition. They don't come from some arbitrary source of authority. They come from you. And that's good in order to start addressing the motivational problem. Next slide. Okay, is that enough? No, probably no. Okay, yeah, yes. There may be an ethical duty to favor the green transition. This ethical duty may be self-imposed, but remember what Diana mentioned at the beginning. We experience all the time decent people, so people who care, enough about morality, keep on doing environmentally bad things. So there must be an extra story. There must be something more needs to be said in order to address the motivational point. Now, it is quite fashionable to use the third critique in order to address this problem. In the recent time, 2022, Angela Breitenbach attempted to use the critique of teleological judgment in order to ground a sort of direct concern that we might have in favor of nature, for the preservation of nature. Well, the idea is simply that we need to look at nature. I mean, that's the story, part of the story that you get in the second part of the critique of the faculty of judgment. We need to look at nature as if it were an organism, and therefore with an analogy with reason. I mean, you need to conceive nature as a big rational organism in a sense, and therefore Angela thinks you can find here a sort of Kantian story on how you cannot fail to pay respect to nature, precisely because in order to know it, we have to think it through an analogy with reason. Next slide. There are many problems with this approach, I think, and the main one, so that we can go to our proposal, the main one is that this necessity of looking at nature as if it were a big organism. Kant is quite explicit, serves only theoretical goal. In order to know nature, you have to look at it in this way, but this doesn't seem to ground any thing in terms of looking at nature as if it had an intrinsic and independent value. You might have to look at something as an organism in order to know it, even if you know, as Kant seems to be saying, that that thing is just a thing. It's just, something that, if anything, has an instrumental value, that is an indirect value to the extent in which it's necessary for what really has value, that is us, and potentially other rational beings scattered across the universe, the famous aliens that others Kant scholars talk about as example of possible additional rational beings. Okay, let's move on to our own proposal. In a nutshell, I'm not following the slides because there is too much in this slide. But the idea, which I recently discovered, I confess, is not entirely original, because I found a little article in a collection from 2011 by Kneller. Diana, help me. What was her name? Kneller, I think. Who makes a similar argument, not entirely identical. But basically, the suggestion is, okay, let's not look at the second part of the critique of judgment. Let's look at the first part of the critique of judgment when Kant talks about aesthetic judgment. Because, of course, for Kant, there are two sets of things that can be beautiful. One is, things that humans produce if they are good artists. The second one is nature. And of course, if Kant has a story about natural beauty and you want to find a motivation to respect nature for the sake of the green transition, I thought, it still seems to me, that the natural place where you want to look at is precisely what Kant says about natural beauty. Now, what's so special about Kant's story on natural beauty? And that's perhaps the only thing that is kind of original here. Well, Kant has, as you know, as any Kant scholar knows, Kant thinks that the experience of the beautiful, so aesthetic judgments, pretty much entail a kind of exemplary harmony between the understanding and the imagination. Why is that an exemplary harmony? And that's a story that I try to cash out in a, by now, old paper that I wrote 20 years ago, on the third critique, in which I try to show that the kind of harmony that takes place between the understanding and the imagination when we make the experience of something beautiful is the paradigm case of harmony that we find also in determinative judgments, when the fit between the imagination and the understanding leads to a determinative judgment. Now, why in the case of aesthetic judgments or reflective judgments, this is a kind of paradigmatic harmony? Well, because sometimes Kant seems to be suggesting that the understanding and the imagination come into this free play, that's his expression, obviously, in which they are harmonious, so they talk to each other. So before a beautiful landscape, the imagination gives us a lot of conceptual possibility, gives to the understanding a lot of conceptual possibility, makes us think, like any beautiful thing, a lot. But this thinking process never ends up into, oh, okay, this is beautiful in the sense that, you know, I could write a formula, or I could express with some precision what makes that thing beautiful. No, I mean, the imagination provides these conceptual opportunities. The understanding tries to catch on and close the process by providing a concept, but it never manages to close the process because the object is too rich, so to speak. So it's a harmony without a concept, right? It's a famous expression of the third critique, purposiveness without a determinative judgment, and so on and so forth. So why is this important for what we are discussing? Well, because it seems to me that this Kantian story captures pretty well the reason why people, and not just philosophers, but common people, feel at home in nature. Feel at home means in this scenario, in this perspective, that through the experience of natural beauty, we come into contact with the immediate fact that nature is there for us to a certain extent. It's there, we are at home in nature because nature entices, stimulates for us a feeling of harmony, actually of paradigmatic harmony within our intellectual faculties. So, of course, my suggestion is not that people should read better, that we should have public lectures on the first part of the third critique in order to make people more sensitive to the green transition. My point is simply to say that each and every human being feels at home in nature, and Kant has a story to explain why this is the case, why nature is not something that is just there like a thing that we can use the way we want, but it's part of us. It's part of our extended subjectivity, precisely because it generates this paradigmatic harmony. So next slide. This is important because it kind of takes away a little instrumentality in Kant's conception of nature. Again, the usual story is that in a Kantian perspective, nature is important only to the extent in which natural resources, nature in general, are important only to the extent in which they serve the only true source of value, that is us. But the aesthetic story that Kant has in the first part of the third critique tells us a very different story, and one that gets us closer to what we want. So to find Kantian grounds that takes us away from a strict logocentrism and, you know, move towards the recognition and solidification of the idea that nature has an intrinsic value, even within a Kantian perspective. So that's why we call this proposal moderate biocentrism, because it's not a biocentrism all the way down, in the sense that, of course, the ultimate highest source of value remain the rational being, but it's a rational being that is situated, that is extended quite outside of his soul or his body, depending on what rational being we are talking about. And therefore, someone who cannot fail but looking at nature with a disposition of awe, respect, and protection. So I'm going to stop here because I want to hear what you think about this proposal, if we have time.
Well, thank you very much, Luigi and Diana, for this very instigating presentation about this very hot topic. Well, we are opening the floor for questions, comments from anyone. Please just let me know if you have any questions or comments by raising your hand. Okay, Charles Emmer, good to see you, Ed. Please go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, these are perhaps rather incidental concerns that would be merely part of the framing of what you're doing and not really go to the core. But one reason that people who are not climate denialists might have resistance to policies is because they feel that larger forces are hoodwinking them. There have been numerous articles recently about how having people participate in plastic recycling is really just a sort of an engineered distraction from the oil industry, from government policy being a solution. And goodness, I had a second point, but it is now. Oh, yeah, and this is a sort of a wider framing problem, which is that of course many of the policies that could help us are being undermined by a global undermining of the cosmopolitan order, this movement towards fascism that we're seeing occur.
Yeah. Shall I answer, Diana, or shall I start
Yes.
to answer? Okay.
Yes, you can
Well,
start.
yeah, these are side comments. I agree, because I can very much relate to both the things you were saying, and I don't see why and how this is going to affect our proposal. So maybe what you have in mind is that if you are worried about the motivational problem, you shouldn't be thinking so much about the third critique about natural beauty, but you should look more closely to very concrete strategies of distraction, the famous weapons of mass distraction and not distraction, like recycling plastic or stuff like that. Yeah, I can see that, and I agree with you. All we are trying to do in this paper is to gain some territory in order to show that Kant has resources for addressing also the motivational problem, which by no means that it's a knockdown resource that once you remind people that nature is beautiful, the game is done and you can go home happy and good. Silvia.
I thank you, Diana and Luigi. My question would be this: you introduced this this part of the aesthetic judgment and how we feel about nature in order to address the motivational problem. My question would be whether you could not also use it for the first part, for showing why it is an ethical duty to preserve nature, in the sense that given the role that that aesthetic feeling has also for ethics. I mean, in a way, it's something that it's a kind of thing that it's part of our rationality, and something that should, as much as the life of future generations should, as much as we should be concerned with that, we should also be concerned with guaranteeing that these kinds of feelings are still available for future generations and for ourselves. So this would be my question. Do you think this should only enter as a motivational aspect, or the peculiarity of our relation with nature, to which Kant points out in the aesthetic judgment, would also be something relevant, something that could also be used? Because in the sense of being something that has, when we think about what is necessary, what is involved in contributing to rationality as such in its further development, it should also enter the picture. Because if not, then my question would be, what if you had a dilemma, say, I mean, for in any, because we could have an ugly world where everybody survives. And so that would be my question. I don't know if it's clear, but thank you once again for your
Diana?
You can go, Luigi.
Okay.
Let's see.
All right. No, Silvia, this is a very good question. There are many dimensions in natural beauty that could be mobilized. And I was trying only to highlight the one that it seems to me is most promising for addressing this motivational problem. Now, of course, Kant has this famous paragraph 42. I mean, morality is a symbol of beauty is a symbol of morality. There is an intellectual interest in the beautiful, which seems to be something close to what I'm saying. That's Paul Geyer's suggestion for me. I don't think that's what I'm saying. I think that what Kant says about the intellectual interest in beautiful things is something different, but I still need to think about it more. What you were suggesting, natural beauty could be mobilized also to ground an ethical duty. And there you made different sub-suggestions, because at one point you said, if we don't preserve the beauty of nature for future generation, we are treating future generation as mere means, pretty much. Or it could be argued along these lines. Or one could, I think the argument, an ugly word that is still livable, that is, could be still a violation of the respect that you owe to other rational beings belonging to future generations, because there is no evident reason why you are allowed to deprive them from the pleasure accompanied by the aesthetic appreciation of nature. Yeah, I agree. The only thing I'm hesitant about is that a good thing about beauty in general in the Kantian philosophy as a whole is that it's not entirely submitted or made something that serves the purpose of morality. It has its own intrinsic value, so to speak. So beauty is not important for Kant just because it's a symbol of morality, just because, by developing taste, you make yourself detached from egoistic interest, and therefore you prepare your soul for the disposition that you need in order to be moral. No, I mean, beauty in a certain sense is beyond good and evil. It has its own value beyond the question of good and evil. And I think this is important because we want to find a kind of ecumenical motivation. We want to find a motivation that can appeal to people endorsing the most diverse comprehensive doctrines you may think of. And the independence of beauty is important if you have this ambition.
Thank you.
Well, guys, thank you very much. Once again, Professors Luigi Carenti and Diana Piroli for this very interesting, thought-provoking presentation. We'll proceed now to our next talk by Professor Joel Klein. And the title of Joel's talk is The Role of Unsocial Sociability in Context of Kant's Philosophy of Right. Joel, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Nitamar, for inviting me. Also, Sylvia, for organizing this event. I would like to share my screen, but I don't know how. Here, can I have the authorization to do it? Okay. Can you see my my screen? Okay. Well, this is a part of a larger paper in which I want to talk about, analyze the concept of social unsociability, not only Kant's legal, but also in political and social philosophy. But for the purpose of this presentation, I will just concentrate myself in the first part, which is the legal aspect. So the relation between social unsocial sociability inside Kant's philosophy of right. Well, I'm assuming will skip some parts of it, but I'm assuming that this Kant never changes his position about the importance of this concept. So we can find traces of it in Perpetual Peace, in Conflict of Faculties, and also inside Kant's philosophy of right. So in order to go straight forward to my point, I will just focus then and read this part of the paper, which is also still a work in progress. It's like the second draft of it so there may be some mistakes and some spelling mistakes still. So please be patient. The role of unsocial sociability in the context of Kant's philosophy of right. In the introduction of Doctrine of Right, Kant writes that we shall often have to take as our object the particular nature of man, which can be known only by experience, in order to extract from it what can be deduced from universal moral principles. End of quote. But he soon stresses that, I quote again, a metaphysics of morals cannot be based on anthropology, but can nevertheless be applied to it. These formulations have led scholars to underestimate the role of anthropological claims in the argument of the doctrine of right. In this section, I will investigate how unsocial sociability functions as an implicit assumption that, although it is not the source of normativity, it's determinant in the way that normativity is shaped in order to construct several different juridical principles that are contextually bounded. The first appearance of the unsocial sociability in the doctrine of right is in the context of the acquisition of first possession. Kant asks, I quote, how far does authorization to take possession of a piece of land extend? As far as the capacity for controlling it extends, that is, as far as whoever wants to appropriate it can defend it, as if the land were to say, if you cannot protect me, you cannot command me, end of quote. The necessity of defense already implies the assumption of a clash between the faculties of choice of different agents. Private right, placed in the state of nature, is shaped by the instability created by unsociability. Even if there is a permissive law on the claim of the first occupier, under the implicit impetus of unsociability, that is, the desire to possess what others already have, the force also has some claim, so the force of claiming the property. In other words, the unsociability affects the private rights in such a way that, even if there had been a first legitimate appropriation, it puts this right under stress. At the end, unsociability renders all rights in the state of nature insecure and unstable. This echoes the ideas, universal history essay thesis, that unsocial sociability is the inescapable fact that necessitates the creation of civil society and the state. I quote, human beings are compelled by need to enter into this condition of coercion, and indeed by the greatest necessity of all, namely that which human beings who inflict on one another, end of quote. This is precisely the reason why this concept reappears in one of the central moments of the doctrine of right, in the transition from private to public right. According to Kant, I quote, "It is not necessary to wait for actual hostility. One is authorized to use coercion against someone who already, by his nature, threatens him with coercion." End of quote. So no one needs to wait until he has learned by bitter experience, I quote, "For what should bind him to wait till he has suffered a loss before he becomes prudent, when he can quite well perceive within himself the inclination of human beings generally to lord it over others as their master." End of quote. Now, the consequences extracted for unsocial sociability seem to directly contradict the principle of nemine laede, which states that, I quote, "Do not wrong anyone, even if, to avoid doing so, you should have to stop associating with others and shun all society." End of quote. This contradiction could perhaps be avoided to the extent that it could be argued that in certain circumstances, it is no longer possible to move away from each other, also due to the condition of sphericity of the earth. And then, in the conflict between the two equally legitimate legal claims, the stronger one prevails. In itself, there is no contradiction between the formula, "Do not wrong anyone, even if, to avoid in doing so, you should have to stop associating with others and shun all society," on the one hand, and the formula, "If you cannot help associating with others, enter into a society with them in which each can keep what is his sum quick tribute," on the other. However, because of unsociability, these two principles collide, which is why Kant recognizes that it is not a question of entering into a civil state amicably, but rather of the legitimacy to forcing each other to enter into such a state. If there were no real conflict shaped by human nature, it would not be possible to conclude that one duty prevails over the other and also allows the use of force. The unsociability does not Hobbesianize Kant's legal philosophy. In Hobbes, the state of war of all against all is seen as the reason for the creation of the state. In other words, the state is a technical solution to the problem of the individual avoiding violent death and a way of life in safety. For Kant, on the other hand, leaving the state of nature and entering the civil state is a moral duty. I quote, "You ought to enter this condition," or "You must leave the state of nature in which it follows its own judgment, unite itself with all others, with which it cannot avoid interacting, subject itself to a public lawful external coercion," end of quote. And will still apply, this is important, however well-disposed and law-abiding human beings might be. In other words, for Kant, the justification of the civil state is not a hypothetical imperative based on a fact, namely, if one wants to avoid war of all against all and the possibility of violent death, a fact, then one must enter the civil state. Whereas Hobbes' justification is based on a hypothetical imperative, Kant's claim is grounded on a categorical imperative. But what allows Kant to move from the duty to establish a civil state to the right to unilaterally use force in the creation of that state? The question of the unilateral use of force in the creation of a civil state can only be understood to the extent that the entire methodology of the construction of the metaphysical principles of law is understood to be substantially influenced by anthropological conditions. In other words, Kant's claim that a metaphysics of morals cannot be based on anthropology, but can nevertheless be applied to it, give rise to a misleading interpretation. It is not a matter of applying a formal principle to amorphous matter. In fact, the application of a general principle to a particular context requires what Kant calls in theory and practice, I quote, more theory. In other words, an intermediate theory that must incorporate the characteristics elements of its context. Thus, unsociability operates in the argumentative process of legal philosophy as a condition or variable that produces substantive consequences in the understanding how to apply the general principle. It's important to note, however, that unsociability does not function as a normative source. that role is played exclusively by the categorical imperative of right. But unsociability established the conditions for the application of the imperative as if it were a second level in which a condition of limitation and interpretation. Thus, the categorical imperative would be valid even if human beings were good and law-abiding. But since they are not, the imperative is interpreted under the condition of unsociable human nature. Under this condition, a permissive law of reason emerges that allows the unilateral use of force to create the civil state. This permission constitutes a subordinate normative level that reflects the combination of the categorical imperative with the conditions of human anthropology. So Kant's entire philosophy of right is permeated by this non-ideal theory, to put in contemporary terms, which requires a clarification of the theoretical character of metaphysical principles as having their normative source a priori, but not being themselves purely a priori. It should be noted that this condition of application does not become a condition of the law itself. It's not a kind of corrupting inversion that Kant criticized in theory and practice when he states that, I quote, all is lost if the empirical and hence contingent conditions of carrying out the law are made conditions of the law itself, so that a practice calculated with reference to an outcome probably in accordance with previous experience is given authority to control a self-sufficient theory. End of quote. So this non-ideal perspective is pervasive in the doctrine of right. One of the consequences is that any historical study of the emergence of the state is futile from a legal point of view. I quote, for savages draw up no record of their submission to law, and second, we can already gather from the nature of uncivilized human beings that they were originally subject to it by force. End of quote. Furthermore, it is culpable to undertake this inquiry with a view to possibly changing by force the constitution that now exists. End of quote. The normativity of the public right and the state is not diminished by its violent emergence, since its justification is based on the capacity of the state to guarantee rights in the present and the potential of its institutions to reform themselves in order to become just. In this case, one can say that for Kant, legal legitimacy is more future-oriented than past-oriented. Unsociability will also contribute to affect the administration of law and the necessary reforms in institutions. As stated in the sixth proposition of the idea, I quote, the human being is an animal which, when it lives among others of its species, has need of a master. But because of his selfish animal inclination, he tends to always misuse his freedom when he has no one over him to exercise authority over him in accordance with laws. End of quote. This is why, when states came into existence, they correspond only to a very problematic and imperfect way to the idea of state, and even more so to the idea of republic. But even with this distance between the ideal and reality, it is the task of non-ideal theory to find a way by which it does not simply confirm the status quo, nor does it adopt the utopian idealist perspective that only that which fulfills all the requirements of practical reason is legitimate. This path will be the subject of Kant's political philosophy, which will be discussed in the next section. For now, it is important to note that unsociability is incorporated into the theory of law in such a way that Kant attributes legal legitimacy to defective and unjust laws and institutions, provided that they establish the civil state, are not averse to reform, and finally, allow for the public use of reason and the right of negative resistance. It is due to unsociability that, I quote, a people has a duty to put up even with what is held to be an unbearable abuse of supreme authority. So, resistance to highest legislation can never be regarded as other than contrary to law, and indeed as abolishing the entire legal constitution. End of quote. In this case, because unsociability is not the normative foundation, but as an inevitable condition under which a normative foundation operates. This is because it's wrong put here. So the case is that is not normative, but how the condition. The civil state that emerged historically is legitimated not because it's perfectly just, but because it is the only institution capable of promoting justice, even if only in the long run. The creation of a new just state through revolution has just as much chance of success as order having to arise from by chance. It's not impossible, but the right-thinking man will not want to go down that road. Many of Kant's controversial statements in the Doctrine of Right can be read as an expression of this equilibrium that a priori principles must strike with respect to anthropological premises and their suitability for the historical process and even to some extent to historical reality. It could be said that the anthropological premise of unsociability constitutes a realistic element in Kant's legal philosophy in the sense that it coldly assumes the pessimistic nature of human relations. Thus, on the one hand, the existing states, despite their historical emergence based on violence, are justified in the sense that no other kind of beginning could be expected, given the crudeness and inexperience of human reason, which is driven by a completely undisciplined unsociability. On the other hand, although the present states are still quite deficient in relation to what is required by the idea of the state and republic, they have already established a certain discipline over unsociability, which allows us to think, from a practical and historical point of view, of a process of reform. The thesis of unsociability affects not only the civil state law, but also international legal relations. I quote, "The same unsociability that necessitates human beings to this civil constitution is once again the cause of every commonwealth in its external relation, as a state in reference to other states, standing in unbound freedom and consequently of each having to expect from the other precisely the ills that pressure individual human beings and compel them to enter into a lawful civil condition." End of quote. Although, I quote again, "moral practical reason pronounces in us its irresistible veto, there is to be no war, neither war between you and me in the state of nature, no war between us as states, the fact of unsociability again imposes itself and demands that reason find a way to reconcile its normative demands with reality. It's in this context that the figure of right to go to war, the right in war, and the right after war emerges in the doctrine of right. The construction of these three types of rights is again the result of the categorical imperative applied under the anthropological condition of unsociability. However, unlike the state of nature between individuals, the state of nature between states, although embedded in the same unsociability, does not lead to the right to establish a federation of nations or eventually a world civil state out of force, as was the case with individuals. In other words, one state cannot force the others to enter into a civil state with it. It's not a matter of unsociability being stronger or the rational obligation to enter into a civil state being weaker, nor is a question of respect for the state as a moral entity, as some have argued. The difference seems to lie in the way in which unsociability can be disciplined. But what is the difference between unsociability at the level of the individual and at the level of state? In the context of state formation, the unilateral use of force for the creation of a civil state, and thus the establishment of external discipline, allows unsociability to continue to operate and produce its positive effects. After all, individuals will continue to exist in society, and their conflict will have the function of promoting culture. From a cosmopolitan point of view, however, if the unilateral use of force were allowed and unsociability of states were unilateral discipline, the positive effects of unsociability will be undermined. It is in this sense that Kant's thesis can be understood in the context of international law, the law of nations. Namely, the state of war, I quote, is nevertheless better in accordance with the idea of reason, then the fusion of them by one power on overgrowing the rest and passing into a universal monarchy. Since as the range of government expands, laws progressively lose their vigor, and a soulless despotism, after it has destroyed the seed of good, finally deteriorates into anarchy. So this soulless despotism is dismissed by nature itself to the influence of unsociability in the social context, which will be on topic that I will work later on in the paper. But I think for now it's sufficient. I would like to have now your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Joel Klein. Now we open the floor for questions and comments. Well, let me ask you a question while other colleagues prepare their comments and questions. This was very interesting and very meticulous in the way you've been exploring the details of this very complex issue. I have a question regarding the way usually when we talk about warlike situations and geopolitics in general, most people in the academia and elsewhere, they tend to resort to Hobbesian arguments or to the so-called realpolitik arguments. And by your presentation, it's clear that, of course, Kant is taking seriously these real-life conditions of unsociability or unsocial sociability. And I was just wondering, how would you respond to this particular problem of interpretation of Kant, especially in the Perpetual Peace essay, regarding Kant's reading of the Hobbesian state of nature? Because some people think that this is almost like a concession to political realism. But in the way you presented, of course, this seems to be much more complicated than this. So I'd just like to see how would you comment on this still going on a challenge of political realism in Hobbesian terms, in the sense that most countries, they are more prepared to wage war against each other as opposed to guaranteeing peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitamar, for your question. It's very important. I think that what Kant will say about Hobbesian position will be a kind of political moralist position, in the sense that at the end, it's not about recognizing how the political and juridical relations actually are, but because they didn't recognize what these political relations should be. So they kind of overlap both positions, and then they lose the sense of what they have to be done. So, for example, of course, Kant had recognized in the international relations that because of the effect of anthropological effect of the anthropological theory of unsocial sociability, the war is a fact. We cannot think of international relation without considering it. But the point is that even the wars, so there are several parts of it, even the wars have to follow some criteria. So not to use, for example, poisoners, or not should do some use of some kind of strategies during war, because the wars should be understood as a kind of just a temporary measure. And after that, we have to produce an international legal system. And the point is then, this idea of that we have to orient it, even during a war, to the idea that the war is not what is a perpetual condition. So the realists actually assume that the condition of war is something that we can never surpass. And this is what I think Kant it makes Kant very different from these positions. So I will say Kant adopts some realist premises, but will not take a realist position, because for him a realist position will be a kind of political moralist position. So it's a kind of hypocritical position which assumes that we are incapable of surpassing this state of nature between nations.
Thank you, Joel. Professor Sylvia Altman, please.
Thank you again. Thank you very much, Joel. My question would be a clarification, just to see whether I understood your last point about the difference between how should well, you're trying to why are we legitimated to coerce other people to enter into a state, but why is no state legitimated to coerce other states to enter? And if I wanted, and you suggest that the difference is that whereas when people are coerced into entering a state, they can still have space or room enough for the good effects that the social and sociability brings in the development of the. Whereas if it were allowed that in the case of the relation among states, you would not have that. So first, I wanted to see what I understood, and also if you could talk a little bit more why you would not have that, because I got the impression that because the passage you quote at the end, it's from Perpetual Peace, seems to be more at first sight more about the ineffectiveness of a law, if you expand that much, than with the fact that there would not be room enough for the good aspects. So I just wanted to ask you whether I understood you correctly, and to ask you to talk a little bit more about this difference, in what sense the good effect, the good equivalent, what would be the good equivalent of the unsocial sociability among relations among states that should be protected in a certain sense, just as in the case of the relation among people in one state.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
This is a very, very important question. Actually, in the literature, there is a long discussion about if, for example, Kant changes position from the perpetual peace in perpetual peace and Doctrine of Right, if, for example, he abandons the idea of the World Republic. The people that argue that he abandons it, they make a case that in one side is based on this argument that is a kind of only a prudential issue, that the states don't want it to, or well, the large of the state will be impossible. But I think this is a very problematic argument, because Kant will never say that the prudential reasoning trumps moral reasons. This is one aspect. So there is other argument that says that in perpetual peace, Kant said that Kant argues that it's a contradiction to talk about a state in the international relations, because then will be a contradiction to call up a republic, because a republic is a state, in a world state, because then will not be anymore a kind of international relation. And I think in this point I follow Pauline Kleingeld, who said that this, where Kant is saying that, is a kind of conceptual contradiction, in the sense that it is not saying, Kant is not saying that we should not, there's a moral contradiction to have a world state. The problem is that when we have a world state, we will not have more international right. So this will be just a kind of very limited kind of contradiction, and it will not be an argument against the world state or a world republic. This is the second argument. Second point. In the third one is the people that argue, well, after perpetual peace, Kant actually started to say that moral states states are a kind of moral persons with their own dignity. And therefore, if in a world state, will be a kind of moral contradiction in this sense. They should not abandon the idea of being an entity. There are several scholars that defend this position. I'm not sure about that. Nowadays I think that is not a correct point, because I could say the same thing for individuals in the state of nature. Well, in the state of nature, individuals also have families, and when the state comes into this, the families are not dissolved. So it's not a point that a kind of legality that state is a kind of lose completely his position. So when the people move from the state of nature to the civil state, families as a moral ground also doesn't lose its dignity because we go from point to another. So it will be the same argument for the states. Will not be a problem if the state abandons his absolute sovereignty to enter into a kind of world republic, because it could still have some divisions in some organization, as it happens with family. So this will be my argument. So then why, I think this will be more coherent argument. So why then Kant says that for individuals we can coerce and for the states don't? I think that the argument then is again about because of the sociability. In the state have to coerce, because in the state of nature, then sociability has counterproductive situations. It produces counterproductive consequences that actually undermine the moral development of human beings. While the unsocial sociability inside the civil state, when disciplined through the law, can produce good consequences, because then people compete. But if this competition are fair, then we have good consequence for development of culture and also morality. And so this is the argument that I think Kant argues, that we have the right to coerce, to produce states between individuals. But in the case of states, I think that if, assuming that one state will be winning other and after other, there will be a situation that they will not allow this. So the states, the case of conquer, the other states will not be a state anymore. While in the case of the individuals, they will be individuals. So I think the beneficial consequence of unsociability will be undermined in a kind of Pax Romana situation. That will be a great state created by force. So I think my argument is actually this difference in Kant is much more related to a kind of teleological argument inside the point than just a kind of pure morally argument to say, well, states has a moral right to exist, and therefore they have a right of absolute sovereignty, and then they don't have to be changed. Of course, then you have to continue to argue that. But my point is, you get it right, I think is about how unsocial sociability is dealt with the relation with the law in these two different levels. I hope that I could answer or indicate the answer that I was thinking.
Thank you. No, that was great. Yeah, thank you.
Well, is there any other question or comment, please? You may as well ask your questions in Portuguese. Professor Emer is also a speaker of Portuguese, right?
I have a question of order. Can we have a short break?
Yes, yes. Right. That's a good point. Okay, guys, so let's take our short break. Once again, thank you very much, Joel, Diana, Luigi, for these wonderful presentations. And we'll be back in 10 minutes at most, okay?
Okay.
See you guys.
See you.
Bom dia, Luciana. Aliás, boa tarde. Imagino que você esteja aí à tarde. Em todo caso, ok, boa tarde. Fizemos um rápido break, um coffee break de 10 minutos. Ok? So, we'll be back in 10 minutes. Ok. Bom dia, boa tarde, colegas. Convido a professora Luciana Martínez, da Universidade de Lisboa, para fazer a próxima apresentação do nosso colóquio internacional Kant, organizado pela Sociedade Kant Brasileira. Estamos aqui com a presidenta da sociedade, professora Silvia Altman, e pelos programas de pós-graduação em filosofia da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul e da PUC-RS em Porto Alegre. Luciana, estás com a palavra, por favor, seja bem-vinda.
Muito obrigada, profesor. Y peço desculpas para os outros palestrantes, porque hoje foi um dia bastante complexo, tinha que ministrar aulas e não consegui participar das outras palestras. E também eu queria dizer que eu decidi mudar de palestra, porque eu iria apresentar uma outra palestra a semana passada no Brasil e não consegui participar do congresso. E realmente é um tema que eu quero muito discutir com os colegas do Brasil. Aí eu decidi hoje apresentar a outra palestra que eu não consegui apresentar a semana passada, que é sobre um tema que estou a trabalhar agora, que é o tema das analogias. Eu já apresentei uma palestra na Sociedade Kant brasileira no início do ano sobre o tema de analogias, mas não apresentei essa palestra, senão uma mais geral. A palestra que vou apresentar tem por título Ilusões e Forças. E vou ler. Esta contribuição é parte de um projeto de pesquisa maior no qual estou trabalhando atualmente e parte do qual apresentei esse ano no Congresso da Sociedade Kant Brasileira. Nesse projeto de pesquisa, estou especificamente focada no conceito kantiano de analogia. Hoje vou compartilhar a análise de uma analogia kantiana. Antes disso, gostaria de salientar como entendo o funcionamento da noção de analogia na filosofia crítica de Kant. Acredito que na construção do sistema crítico, o filósofo recupera três noções diferentes de analogia e as reformula para diferentes propósitos. Em cada caso, temos obras de outros autores e menções no corpus lógico, no corpus kantiano não crítico, que nos permitem entender o significado que a analogia tinha em cada campo. Além disso, encontramos passagens do trabalho crítico que nos permitem entender como o conceito é recuperado, como é redefinido e como é usado na construção da filosofia crítica. No texto que compartilhei com a comunidade kantiana brasileira em abril, levando em conta a origem disciplinar de cada uso, nomeei essas noções da seguinte forma: analogia retórica, analogia matemática e analogia lógica. Considero que a noção retórica, da qual tratarei mais detalhadamente daqui a pouco, difere significativamente das outras duas. Começarei minha explicação com as outras duas. As analogias matemáticas e lógicas são, na minha opinião, procedimentos argumentativos diferentes. Chamo de analogias matemáticas um tipo de procedimento que é usado em investigações matemáticas para obter conhecimento. Esse procedimento fornece conhecimento certo e determinado. Especificamente, por meio de analogias, em matemática podemos calcular quantidades determinadas com precisão. Em matemática, a analogia é a equivalência entre duas proposições, entre duas proporções. Se conhecermos a relação entre dois valores e um terceiro, podemos estabelecer com certeza a existência e a magnitude de um quarto, de modo que a relação entre o terceiro e ele seja idêntica à que encontramos entre os dois primeiros. Na filosofia crítica, Kant recupera a noção matemática de analogias para mencionar e descrever um conjunto de princípios do entendimento puro, que são as analogias da experiência. Esses princípios estabelecem relações legais constitutivas da experiência no dado fenomênico. No entanto, eles não constituem analogias no sentido matemático estrito, em virtude do fato de que o quarto elemento da experiência não pode ser construído a priori, como é o caso da matemática, mas tem que ser dado na sensibilidade. Essa é a primeira noção de analogia. A noção de analogia que podemos encontrar na estrutura da lógica é a de outro tipo de inferência.
Vou deixar aqui, ó.
Oi?
É.
Desculpa, eu não estou a ouvir direto.
Mil desculpas, desculpa, o meu microfone não estava mutado, Luciano.
Ah, tá, mas está a ouvir direto?
Sim.
Tá. As analogias matemáticas, as analogias lógicas. A analogia usada na lógica é um tipo de inferência não dedutiva, que fornece conhecimento não apodítico. Na lógica, uma analogia é uma forma de conhecer propriedades de coisas das quais não temos experiência, com base numa comparação entre essas coisas e outras cujas propriedades podemos conhecer. Assim, por exemplo, se soubermos que duas pessoas compartilham muitas características e que uma delas reage a uma determinada classe de situações de uma certa maneira, em virtude das características compartilhadas, presumimos que a outra pessoa também reagirá da mesma maneira, embora não tenhamos conhecimento certo disso. De acordo com o corpus lógico disponível, a inferência por analogia, assim como a indução, foi considerada uma forma deficiente de inferência que, no entanto, é importante e necessária para a ampliação do conhecimento. Em contraste com a maneira matemática de conhecer por analogia, na qual a razão está envolvida, as analogias com as quais a lógica se preocupa são inferências feitas pela faculdade de julgar. Na estrutura da lógica, assim como na da matemática, as analogias são apresentadas como formas de inferência. Mas, se na matemática o uso das analogias envolve a razão e fornece conhecimento certo, o procedimento no qual a qual a lógica se refere é realizado pelo juízo e não fornece certeza. Kant recupera essa noção de analogia lógica precisamente no contexto da crítica do juízo. Lá encontramos a noção mais comumente considerada de analogia. Como no contexto da própria lógica, na crítica do juízo, a analogia é uma tentativa de ter algum acesso a objetos dos quais não temos experiência. Especificamente, a analogia é uma forma de tentar ter acesso às propriedades de Deus. Tanto as analogias matemáticas quanto as analogias lógicas e suas respectivas reapropriações no âmbito da crítica têm sido objeto de pesquisas específicas. Eu me referi às diferenças entre essas duas noções de analogia e seu uso no âmbito da filosofia crítica em um artigo anterior que compartilhei no Congresso da Sociedade Kantiana do Brasil. Nessa contribuição de hoje, gostaria de me concentrar em uma terceira noção de analogia e em um exemplo interessante dela. Como no caso das analogias matemáticas e da analogia lógicas, designarei nesse terceiro tipo de acordo com a disciplina na qual ele surge. Considero que, nesse terceiro uso, Kant recorre à analogia como uma figura da linguagem, ou seja, como um tipo de metáfora um pouco mais elaborada. Acho que esse uso de analogias é o mais comum no trabalho crítico e tem, pelo menos, uma função ou utilidade específica. As analogias, em um sentido retórico, permitem que Kant introduza um novo aparato conceitual com o qual o leitor não estava familiarizado. Esse aparato conceitual não envolve tanto novas palavras quanto novos conceitos. A filosofia crítica refere-se a representações e aspectos do pensamento que não haviam sido identificados antes. A introdução de novos conceitos envolve dificuldades específicas, e a prosa de Kant expressa um enorme esforço em sua pretensão de ser generoso como leitor. Kant recorre a termos latinos, familiares ao leitor universitário. Além disso, ele introduz comentários e críticas aos sistemas usuais da filosofia, bem como referências aos conteúdos ensinados nas disciplinas filosóficas já disponíveis, como a matemática e a lógica. Minha hipótese de leitura é que o uso de analogias no sentido das figuras retóricas é mais um recurso de Kant para incorporar um novo sistema conceitual, o da filosofia transcendental. Esse recurso tem sido estudado em grande detalhe no campo da filosofia lusófona, um trabalho fundamental para a abordagem dos recursos retóricos nos escritos de Kant é a tese de doutorado do professor Leonel Ribeiro dos Santos, publicada como livro na década de 1990, como título Metáforas da Razão ou Economia Poética do Pensar Kantiano. A obra de Ribeiro dos Santos incorpora o tratamento de metáforas ao problema mais amplo da linguagem por meio da qual se constrói o pensamento crítico e especificamente aborda a questão no âmbito dos elementos simbólicos encontrados no corpo textual. O trabalho do autor explora as imagens que Kant extrai das seguintes áreas: química, ciências espaciais, arquitetura, organismos, ótica, domínio jurídico. Desde então, como sabemos, o tema tem sido estudado em detalhe. A publicação mais recente, a qual por motivos geográficos ainda não tive acesso, é a de o professor Joãozinho Beckenham, que publicou esse ano um livro sobre as analogias. Mas se recuperarmos a linha de leitura que estou propondo, apontamos 3 sentidos diferentes da noção de analogia. 2 desses sentidos envolvem formas de inferência e o terceiro, conforme apontamos, constitui um procedimento conveniente para a introdução de novos termos. No restante da minha apresentação, pretendo explicar essa noção de analogia e ilustrar seu funcionamento por meio de uma passagem que deu o título a esta palestra. Como figuras de linguagem, analogias e metáforas são recursos semelhantes que diferem em termos de seu nível de complexidade. Apesar das diferenças entre elas, são empregadas para fins retóricos que geralmente estão associados a aspectos estéticos e didáticos da apresentação no texto. Analogias e metáforas tornam os textos mais amigáveis ao leitor, aproximando conceitos áridos ou obscuros por meio de uma conexão parcialmente arbitrária estabelecida entre eles e outras representações com as quais o leitor presumivelmente está familiarizado. É claro que outras motivações para o uso de analogias retóricas podem ser consideradas. Não vamos nos deter nos estudos filosóficos fornecidos pelo século XX com relação à função filosófica e ao significado das metáforas e analogias. Tampouco poderíamos refletir sobre as áreas temáticas que Kant aborda por meio dessas figuras em sua obra. Essa tarefa tem ocupado inúmeros pesquisadores, especialmente no Brasil. Gostaria de compartilhar um caso que, em minha opinião, ilustra uma maneira pela qual Kant emprega esses recursos. Em algumas passagens, Kant se refere a esse uso de analogias como de senso comum. Acredito que esse seja um dos recursos que lhe permitem tornar compreensíveis para o leitor conceitos de um campo de pesquisa completamente novo. Vejamos a seguinte passagem. Na introdução da dialética transcendental na crítica da razão pura, Kant tenta introduzir e explicar a noção de transcendental Schein. Ele diz o seguinte, acho que vou copiar o texto, para não ler porque é uma passagem bastante longa. Vou copiar o texto na introdução da dialética transcendental. A tradução é a do professor Costa Matos, na editora Voces. Então, não consigo encaminhar. Consigo não. Não consigo encaminhar bom. Eu vou comentar o texto e depois vou ler só uma passagem que é a mais relevante, sim? Mas é o primeiro parágrafo, a primeira parte da introdução da dialética transcendental. Na passagem, encontramos um esforço de Kant para distinguir entre conceitos que parecem semelhantes, mas que têm significados técnicos muito diferentes. Schein, Erscheinung, wahrscheinlich. Kant está introduzindo uma nova ciência, a dialética transcendental, que lida com um conceito até então desconhecido. Para isso, ele precisa refinar a linguagem. Para aperfeiçoar a linguagem, ele emprega várias ferramentas. Entre elas, encontramos a explicação de termos semelhantes, como vemos nessa passagem, assim como de sinônimos latinos que permeiam a obra de Kant. A pergunta para a qual a passagem, o primeiro parágrafo da dialética transcendental, tenta dar uma resposta é a questão mesma da tarefa de uma dialética. A lógica kantiana inclui dois momentos ou capítulos, que são a analítica e a dialética. Na analítica do uso puro do entendimento, Kant conseguiu deduzir os conceitos que essa faculdade produz e os princípios puros que se derivam deles. O que uma dialética pode acrescentar à investigação da faculdade de pensar? Kant diz que a dialética é uma lógica da aparência ilusória, Schein. Mas essa explicação não é por si mesma suficiente. Kant precisa esclarecer ao leitor em que consiste a investigação da aparência ilusória. Para isso, ele distingue essa aparência ilusória de outros dois conceitos, o de probabilidade, Wahrscheinlichkeit, e o de fenômeno, Erscheinung. Ao fazer isso, ele tenta separar a segunda parte de sua lógica de outras seções de lógicas disponíveis, como a lógica do conhecimento provável encontrada em livros escolares de lógica, e a fenomenologia, que é apresentada como um resquício leibniziano no Neues Organon de Lambert. Nos termos atuais, diríamos que ela pertence, a doutrina da probabilidade pertence à lógica da indução, que está incluída na parte analítica da lógica. A doutrina da probabilidade, que é a primeira coisa que Kant separa da dialética, lida com um conhecimento insuficientemente fundado e não é o tema da dialética kantiana. O problema da diferença entre fenômenos e aparências ou ilusões é um problema que ocupou Kant desde muito cedo no seu pensamento. Assim, por exemplo, é um tema relevante para a compreensão do principal impulso da sua dissertação em 1770. Para o Kant da crítica da razão pura, o fenômeno é o objeto na medida em que é dado à nossa intuição sensível. É uma representação não intelectualmente determinada. É o dado nos meros sentidos. É fundamental não confundir a noção de fenômeno com a de aparência. Para Kant, a sensibilidade em si não é a sede do erro, mas é uma fonte inescapável de todo o conhecimento do objeto. O fenômeno não é causa de erro, nem é objeto da lógica. A lógica, tanto em sua parte analítica quanto em sua parte dialética, está preocupada com a nossa capacidade de pensar e não com a nossa receptividade. Então, a sensibilidade não é a fonte de erro. E a doutrina da ilusão transcendental, a dialética, a segunda parte da lógica, não tem que lidar com o problema do fenômeno, que é um problema estético. O entendimento isolado também não é fonte de erro. A verdade não é uma característica de intuições, já vimos, nem de conceitos, mas de nossos juízos. Nosso entendimento fornece um componente constitutivo de juízos verdadeiros. Especificamente, o entendimento produz conhecimento que funciona como um cânon, ou seja, como uma condição negativa da verdade. Os juízos que contradizem as leis do entendimento não podem ser verdadeiros. A concordância com as leis do entendimento, das quais a lógica general se ocupa, é uma condição sine qua non para a verdade dos juízos. Mas a verdade não tem a ver só com o entendimento. A verdade tem a ver com a referência de nossos juízos aos objetos. O erro surge precisamente da ligação entre as faculdades e não apenas no funcionamento isolado de qualquer uma delas. Para descrever a natureza dessa ligação entre as faculdades no erro, na passagem que eu não consegui ler porque é muito longa e não tinha tempo, Kant introduz uma analogia para explicar a relação entre as duas faculdades na origem do erro. E essa analogia é a analogia que eu queria compartilhar com vocês e que vou ler rapidamente. Como não temos nenhuma outra fonte de conhecimento, todavia, além dessas duas, sensibilidade e entendimento, segue-se que o erro é só efetuado através da influência desapercebida da sensibilidade sobre o entendimento, quando os fundamentos subjetivos do juízo confluem com os objetivos e os desviam de sua destinação. Do mesmo modo, um corpo em movimento, por si mesmo, permaneceria sempre em uma linha reta na mesma direção. Mas passa a um movimento curvilíneo quando outra força ou influência a tomar uma direção diversa. Para diferenciar a ação própria do entendimento da força que nele se imiscui, será necessário considerar o juízo errado como a diagonal entre duas forças que determinam o juízo em duas direções diferentes e que, por assim dizer, circunscrevem um ângulo e decompor aquela ação conjunta nas ações simples do entendimento e da sensibilidade, o que deve ocorrer em juízos puros a priori através da reflexão transcendental, pela qual, como já foi mostrado, cada representação tem indicado seu lugar na capacidade cognitiva e é a ela adequada, e, portanto, é distinguida também a influência desta sobre aquele. Esta passagem é a passagem da analogia, que eu denomino retórica, que Kant utiliza para explicar sua concepção do erro. Os juízos e os erros, essa foi uma citação de Kant. Os juízos e os erros, nos juízos, são explicados por meio de uma analogia como conhecimento extraído da matemática aplicada. Especificamente, na física, entendemos e representamos sistemas de forças que atingem um corpo por meio de vetores. Para calcular e entender a resultante dessas forças, organizamos esses vetores em eixos cartesianos ortogonais que nos permitem calcular as dimensões, a direção e o sentido da força resultante por meio de cálculos trigonométricos simples. O erro é apresentado como resultado da interação entre duas forças que interagem no processo de conhecimento, sensibilidade e entendimento. A analogia não implica que possamos calcular a magnitude do erro, nem mesmo estabelece uma semelhança entre as coisas comparadas que nos permitiria saber algo novo sobre elas. Não é um procedimento de inferência, nem semelhante ao da matemática, nem ao da lógica. Por meio dessa analogia, Kant consegue apresentar o problema de forma simples e compreensível para seu público. A analogia tomada da física permite que ele descreva a natureza do erro e aponte o procedimento analítico que o descompõe em seus componentes e nos permite evitá-lo. O próximo passo no trabalho kantiano, e em minha pesquisa, é introduzir a noção de ilusão e as diferentes noções de ilusão, até chegarmos à noção de ilusão transcendental, que é o conceito que nos permite elucidar a tarefa da dialética transcendental. Era isso. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado, Luciana, pela instigante apresentação. Teremos mais um momento para perguntas e comentários, logo após a apresentação da professora doutora Soraya Nur, que já se encontra aqui conosco na nossa sala. Muito bem-vinda, Soraya. É um grande prazer te rever e te receber aqui nesse colóquio internacional Kant. A professora Soraya Nur é bem conhecida de todos e todas. Ela atua junto à Nova School of Law e tem sido uma grande embaixadora do cosmopolitismo kantiano na Europa. Seja bem-vinda, professora Soraya, estás com a palavra.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Muito obrigada pelo convite para participar desse colóquio. E eu não sei se eu estava com um programa antigo, eu achei que estava entrando no horário certo, mas parece que já tinha começado antes. Mas peço perdão, então. E vou começar, então, com a minha apresentação. E eu tinha preparado em inglês, mas se preferirem, eu posso tentar fazer uma tradução simultânea para o português.
Well, it's up to you, Soraya. You can give your talk in English.
Então, tá
It's
bom.
okay.
So, Kant's concept of peace is deeply rooted in the idea of cosmopolitanism. Contemporary social, political, and legal theories inspired by Kant's cosmopolitanism vary significantly in their objectives and methods, but they all seek to address the status of individuals as citizens of the world rather than as members of specific nation states. One of the main critiques of these Kantian cosmopolitanism theories is their highly normative nature, often positioning them as ideal or aspirations rather than frameworks of substantial explanatory power. Ulrich Beck highlighted this distinction by contrasting philosophical cosmopolitanism, focused on what ought to be, with sociological cosmopolitanism, focused on what actually is, suggesting that the former may not be necessary for understanding the latter. These oppositions are misleading and should be transcended. Critical reconstructions of Kant's cosmopolitanism seek to truly reassess the moral assumptions underlying cosmopolitan theories and position them within broader social and political contexts. They also aim to bridge the gap between cosmopolitan methodology, which emphasizes individuals in the global arena, and state-centered or territorial methodology, which focuses on local dynamics by integrating both perspectives. This approach blends theoretical and explanatory frameworks to address pressing issues such as racism, nationalism, xenophobia, and the challenges faced by migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, displaced people, ethnic minorities, and indigenous communities. Critical reconstructions of Kant's cosmopolitanism comprise 5 key dimensions, which call for a fundamental reformulation of state-centered modern theories of justice, democracy, and citizenship. The first dimension is the cosmopolitan self. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism envisions a worldview where the construction of a cosmopolitan self is a matter of justice. Political theories that disregard identity issues fail to explain why universal principles often cannot withstand nationalism, racism, and xenophobia. The second dimension is cosmopolitan democracy. Unlike the national model of democracy framed by modern political theory, critical Kantian cosmopolitanism sees local political legal orders as truly democratic only when they respect the environment and the human rights of all people regardless of their citizenship, as for instance, Mencken and Pullman has argued. The third dimension is cosmopolitan cross-border citizenship. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism redefines the modern concept of citizenship, moving beyond territorial boundaries and traditional notions of representation. They help to explain the emergence of cross-border associations of individuals, both institutionalized and also informal. The fourth dimension is cosmopolitan law. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism reshapes modern international law, traditionally centered on states, by recognizing individuals as subjects of international law. This cosmopolitan law, rather than international law, accounts for developments such as the right of individual petition in human rights cases and individual accountability in international criminal law. Finally, the fifth dimension is cosmocentrism. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism promotes an ecological consciousness that emphasizes the interconnectedness of the self and the cosmos, requiring a significant rethinking of modern anthropocentric views. So the first dimension of critical Kantian cosmopolitanism pertains to the ethical framework for constructing a cosmopolitan worldview. Traditionally, cosmopolitanism, as formulated in antiquity, represents the moral idea of a universal community of human beings viewed independently of their affiliations with specific communities. In this context, the ethical goal is the development of a cosmopolitan self. However, this ideal often confronts exclusive private bonds such as nationalism, racism, sexism, and various forms of discrimination related to identity issues. Therefore, it's essential to examine the conditions for critical Kantian cosmopolitanism in a context where violence arises from the imposition of exclusive identities on those who are considered part of a we, while excluding others deemed outside that group. The fundamental question is, do personal identity concerns influence public life? This inquiry encompasses several dimensions. A normative question first, what are the just rights and good values? Second, a question of social theory, what enables individuals to commit to these principles and what just institutions correspond to them. And finally, as Renaud has formulated, a question of philosophical anthropology. What is the nature of personal identity concern collective belongings? As Palin analyzes, the first response posits that public space should prioritize universal values and maintain neutrality regarding identity issues to ensure plurality. According to this view, the particular and contingent nature of biographical, social, and cultural identity elements cannot determine justice. The second response argues that such neutrality is unattainable, as politics and justice inherently legitimize certain conceptions of personal identity, while rendering others invisible, devalued, or stigmatized. Thus, recognizing particularities as a matter of justice becomes essential, as for instance, Taylor and Kimberly Kant has argued. A third response emphasizes translation as a prerequisite for effective universalism, which relies on the ability to communicate successfully without predefined common codes. This approach does not endorse relativism that accepts discrimination and inequality. Rather, it is justified only if it serves to expand rights. While cosmopolitan liberalism, as articulated by thinkers like Rawls, promotes a form of rationality detached from emotional engagement, critical Kantian cosmopolitanism recognizes that rationality can evoke enthusiasm, as Kant has argued, in the conflict of equities, a passionate commitment that drives action and participation. This is supported by discussions in the history of philosophy and contemporary insights from neuroscience. Additionally, it critiques our selective empathy, how we feel the suffering of some, yet simultaneously neglect others whose pain we do not grieve, as Judith Butler has argued. So the second part, cosmopolitan democracy. Kant's cosmopolitanism addresses a key paradox of the contemporary world. Globalization has eroded the traditional concept of a society of states as non-state actors driven by economic, cultural, and religious concerns increasingly shape global affairs. Some scholars now prefer the term global politics to describe this evolving landscape, rather than international or transnational politics. At the same time, while individuals and non-state actors play a growing role, certain states, either directly or through international governance bodies, continue to exert substantial influence over the global order. Furthermore, the protection and exercise of civil, political, social, and cultural rights remain predominantly tied to the state. A crucial challenge, as addressed by critical Kantian cosmopolitanism, is how to link local democracy to a cosmopolitan horizon. According to Kant's concept of cosmopolitan law, a democratic state should not passively await the development of cosmopolitan law from external sources, but rather should first embody cosmopolitan principles within its own borders, as Mencken and Pullman has argued. Local democracy must consider its place in the broader context of humanity, acknowledge the impact of its policies on all individuals, including future generations, treating them not merely as citizens of a particular state, but as members of humanity. The cosmopolitization of state democracy is thus central to Kant's vision. For a democratic government to be genuinely democratic, it must not limit itself to the principle of popular sovereignty within its own borders, but must encompass all of humanity. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism emphasizes that even territorially confined local policies must reflect cosmopolitan values. This includes respecting civil rights, such as the right to vote for members of a political community, while also safeguarding the fundamental rights of all residents, regardless of citizenship, and recognizing the human rights of all individuals worldwide. Importantly, the cosmopolitan outlook also demands attention to issues like environmental stewardship and the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights. In this way, Kant's interrelation of constitutional, international, and cosmopolitan law is realized. Cosmopolitan law subsumes both constitutional and international law, binding them within a framework that respects the rights of all humanity. Therefore, the goal of a democratic state is not merely self-governance, but to embody cosmopolitanism in practice, ensure that democracy extends beyond borders and includes the entire human community. The third dimension, cosmopolitan citizenship. A third issue addressed by critical Kantian cosmopolitanism is how to democratize the global system. This raises questions about how to adapt principles and practice established within the nation-state framework to a global context. How can you develop new forms of democracy that do not rely on territorial foundations? How do you move beyond national citizenship in the absence of a formal cosmopolitan citizenship? What plausible conceptions of organization, practice, and historical transformation would be relevant in this context? Kant addressed these questions. Kant's concept of cosmopolitics is fundamentally grounded in the principle of publicity, which he regards as essential for the exercise of cosmopolitan citizenship. In Perpetual Peace, Kant elevates publicity to the status of supreme principle of justice, placing it at the heart of his vision for lasting peace. This principle transcends the dominant argument of his time that emphasized political-economic liberalism and the role of enlightened rulers in promoting peace. While Kant does incorporate certain liberal ideas into his philosophy of history, such as the notion that individuals pursuing their self-interest can, through the mechanism of unsociable sociability, arrive at juridical rational ideas that safeguard life and property and foster the full development of human reason, B ultimately see these as insufficient for achieving perpetual peace. Kant also acknowledges that positive role that enlightened rulers guided by natural law and moral principles can play in turning the theory of right into political practice, yet while he recognizes progressive elements in both individual self-interest and the actions of moral politicians, he views these approaches as capable of producing only a provisional peace. The attainment of perpetual peace, according to Kant, requires a different foundation. It must be the work of the public, guided by the principle of publicity, rather than the outcome of unsociable sociability or the moral actions of rulers, no matter how prudent or just these may be. Most interpretations of Kant tend to emphasize either the role of his philosophy of history in realizing natural law or the actions of moral politicians in achieving justice, often overlooking the critical democratic force embedded in the principle of publicity. However, it is through this principle that the idea of cosmopolitan law can be fully realized. The principle of publicity presupposes the active participation of cosmopolitan citizenship. To fully understand Kant's vision, three key elements must be examined. First, the principle of publicity itself calls for transparency and openness in the public sphere. Second, the agent responsible for achieving cosmopolitan law, the public. This public is not merely a passive audience, but an active participant in the realization of justice. Third, Kant's notion of the public is not limited to a literary or intellectual practice, but also includes a revolutionary dimension. According to Kant, only a revolutionary public acting in accordance with the principle of publicity, as seen in the French revolutionaries and their enthusiastic supporters abroad, can bring about true cosmopolitan law. This public is not confined to a single nation, rather it is cosmopolitan in nature, exemplified by the cross-border solidarity between the French revolutionaries and their admirers as Kant outside France. Kant's cosmopolitanism thus emerges as the practice of citizenship defined by activity rather than status, cosmopolitics, a form of engagement that forces collective militants across borders, irrespective of organizational structure. This concept aligns with the idea of cosmopolitan citizenship as a network citizenship, distinct from traditional territorial citizenship. It offers a framework for understanding contemporary resistance movements, which, in Kantian terms, hold the potential for generating cosmopolitan citizenship through their transnational actions. Currently, there is no democratic representation within the most influential international organizations and global governance institutions. Conversely, various forms of associations in civil society are emerging that transcend borders, creating new types of citizenship, often referred to as network citizenship, in contrast to traditional territorial citizenship. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism offers a unique perspective on cosmopolitan citizenship distinct from ideas like word society, word public sphere, or collective conscience. It emphasizes political participation over consensus building. While traditional theories of representation may struggle to recognize the legitimacy of these spontaneous extra-parliamentary associations due to the absence of a formal authorization, their legitimacy can instead be rooted in mechanisms of control and accountability. Modern political theory has long linked the exercise of democratic citizenship and legitimate representation to the framework of local political institutions. However, contemporary developments in theories of justice have expanded these notions, proposing new forms of democracy and citizenship that transcend the state. Although states continue to exert significant influence on the global order and individual actors through their actions and cross-border engagements are increasingly shaping global politics in decisive ways. Most contemporary efforts to transpose democracy to the global stage are rooted in the concept of constitution as a legal instrument that limits state power in favor of citizen autonomy. In this context, democracy does not fully align with the notion of people's sovereignty, as universal principles are seen as transcending national borders. Consequently, in many contemporary approaches to global democracy, the sovereignty of the people is weakened. However, the concept of constitution has also a second dimension, closely linked to democracy, which emphasizes the founding act of establishing constitutional norms and, more importantly, the constituent power that derives from the people's sovereignty. As a lot of authors have stressed, this constituent power, expressed through both individual and collective sovereignty, becomes the key criterion for democratizing transnational relations. Sorry, just a moment. The democratization of transnational relations must be grounded both in the self-affirmation of political subjects and in the respect for human rights. These two perspectives should not be seen as opposing forces, but rather as complementary. Constituent power reflects the process of self-emancipation of the political subject, while human rights act as a safeguard to prevent any political subject from asserting itself in a way that oppresses its members or excludes others. In this light, the potential for democratizing international, global, or cosmopolitan relations lies in the practice of cross-border extra-parliamentary associations of individuals. Do I still have time?
Yes, please go ahead.
So, the fourth dimension, cosmopolitan law. Kant's concept of cosmopolitan law addresses multiple challenges in international legal doctrine, particularly the recognition of the individual as a subject of international, or rather cosmopolitan law. Kant argued as early as the late 18th century that individuals should be seen as subjects of cosmopolitan law, independent of their states. However, throughout the 19th and the early 20th centuries, international legal doctrine resisted this idea, maintaining that treaties could not directly confer rights or obligations on individuals. States were seen as the primary actors in international law, and any rights or duties individuals held were mediated through their national legal systems. I quote then here an opinion of the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1928. It may be readily admitted that, according to a well-established principle of international law, a treaty, being an individual agreement, cannot, as such, create direct rights and obligations for private individuals. Since the second half of the 20th century, this view has been challenged by significant developments in international law, particularly in areas like human rights, international criminal law, environmental law, and the common heritage of humanity. Critical Kantian cosmopolitanism plays a central role in rethinking these state-centered legal categories, arguing for the need to redefine international law to account for the individual as a direct subject of international law, or rather cosmopolitan law. This evolving framework, termed then cosmopolitan law, grants individuals rights and obligations that transcend state boundaries, challenging the traditional notion that only states can grant or enforce such rights in the global scene. Many authors argue that individuals do not possess the status of subject of international law, as it's typically the state that grants individuals rights and imposes obligations within its legal frameworks. To address this issue, it's essential to explore two key aspects, as Cassese has argued. First, the circumstances under which individuals can be recognized as subjects of international law, particularly in cases of individual responsibility in international criminal law, and the right to individual petition in human rights, and how these traditional categories of international law must be truly transformed in the context of cosmopolitan law. Cosmopolitan law operates in three key dimensions then: individual responsibility for international crimes, second, the right to be free from violations of such crimes, and third, the right to petition international bodies. So then the fifth dimension, the cosmocentrism. Fifth aspect of critical Kantian cosmopolitanism addresses the broader vision of the universe as a whole, exploring the place of each natural phenomenon within it and the relationship between its parts and the universe itself. This includes considering the human being's role in the universe as one entity among many, and the consequences of human actions, which translate into ecological and environmental concerns, and even aesthetic questions. The concept of cosmopolitanism inherently includes the notion of the cosmos. However, how to conceive the cosmos, whether as an organism, machine, network, system, cause, or a set of forces, is a matter of debate. Equally contested is the relationship between humans and the cosmos. Some thinkers view the cosmos as the world of nature, an object in which humans are merely one natural being among others, not a subject. For others, the cosmos represents a unity between subject and object, where our perception of the world is shaped by how we think and feel. These questions give rise to numerous controversies regarding humanity's place in the universe. For some thinkers, understanding what it means to be human is inseparable from understanding humanity's position in the cosmos. Thus, cosmology often implies anthropology, and for some, it also encompasses ethics and aesthetics. Many authors argue that the history of humanity can only be fully understood in the context of the history of the cosmos. For philosophers like Kant and Alexander von Humboldt, the idea of a common origin for all things in the cosmos is deeply tied to the conception of humanity and a cosmopolitan worldview. Modern anthropocentrism, which asserts human superiority over nature, has legitimized destructive modes of production and consumption, treating nature as merely a means to human ends. The current ecological crisis underscores the interconnectedness of all natural beings and highlights the inadequacies of a cosmopolitan theory that does not account for nature. While there is growing demand for consumer accountability, what is also needed is a structural social-political transformation and the cultivation of new ecological consciousness. This shift requires a rethinking of humanity's relationship with nature and may also involve the possibility of holding leaders of legal entities criminally responsible for environment crimes through acts of omission. The idea of human superiority over nature also contributes to the devaluation of the beautiful nature. Restoring an appreciation for the beauty of nature, an aesthetic issue, carries ethical and political implications, as it fosters a renewed sense of respect and responsibility for the natural world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Soraya, for this wonderful lecture. Well, guys, we have enough time for questions and comments addressed both to Luciana and Soraya. Could be done in Portuguese, in English. Bom, eu vou fazer uma pergunta para a Luciana. Bom, aí eu vi agora a tua mão. Ah, bom, vou passar então primeiro. Professoras, a Silvia, professor Joel e mais alguém que queira. Ah, aqui, a Michele. Obrigado, Michele. Então, Silvia, Joel e Michele. Vamos fazer essa round primeiro, por favor.
Obrigada a ambas pelas excelentes conferências. Pena vocês não poderem estar aqui com a gente, mas esperamos a próxima. Eu tinha primeiro uma pergunta para a Luciana, começar por essa e passar para os demais perguntas. Eu não sei, eu achei bem, obviamente, muito interessante, e eu queria saber se tinha pensado se a gente poderia fazer com cada uma das ilusões transcendentais, ou com pelo menos alguma delas, tentar tornar a analogia mais específica, no sentido de, bom, o que acontece nos paralogismos, né? Qual seria a linha natural do entendimento, linha de força, para continuar a analogia natural do entendimento, qual seria da sensibilidade, como é que elas se misturam, e depois antinomias e para o ideal da razão pura. Então, era um pouco saber se tu tinhas pensado sobre isso, porque pareceu promissor tentar usar, enfim, para isso. Obrigada.
Joel, por favor.
Obrigado, Luciana. Obrigado, Soraya, pelas falas, pelas palestras. Tenho perguntas para ambas. Para a Luciana, a primeira haveria uma diferença entre o uso de analogia da perspectiva teleológica, estética e reflexionante estética e reflexionante teleológica? No sentido de que uma busca ou não produzir conceitos determinados e a outra mantém o jogo. Esse é o ponto. Segundo, para a Luciana ainda, naquela passagem que você fez questão de destacar, da crítica pura, em que o erro é a atuação despercebida da sensibilidade sobre o entendimento, o que você entende por sensibilidade ali? Você entende a sensibilidade no sentido da estética transcendental? Ou seria sensibilidade no sentido mais amplo do elemento sensível do ser humano? Porque Kant tem algo muito parecido na antropologia, uma afirmação sobre essa. E eu tenho mais tendência a entender pelo segundo aspecto, porque como a sensibilidade, como faculdade, é passiva, seria difícil entender como a sensibilidade tem uma influência despercebida sobre o entendimento. Enfim, mas eu queria escutar você sobre esse ponto. Ficou claro? E para a Soraya, eu não sei se eu entendi bem, mas talvez eu tenha perdido esse ponto, mas para estruturar toda essa estrutura em diferentes níveis do direito cosmopolita, ou do cosmopolitismo jurídico, você acha que isso seria possível de ocorrer num nível apenas do ponto de vista da Federação das Nações, ou a gente precisaria ter algo mais robusto, de um ponto de vista internacional, para que isso pudesse ocorrer? Ou seja, algo mais em direção ou um caminho de uma espécie de república mundial em que você tivesse a perspectiva de um aparato coercitivo operando, não só do aparato judicial, mas também do aparato coercitivo. Obrigado.
Michele.
Obrigada, Anitta. Obrigada, Luciana. Obrigada, Soraya, pelas conferências. A minha pergunta é bem mais básica, assim, é para a Luciana, é de compreensão. Eu acho que eu caí bem numa hora que tu estavas explicando o papel da analogia para a distinção entre as faculdades, sensibilidade e entendimento. E, se eu peguei direito, também pode ser que eu não tenha pego, porque eu caí naquele momento. Tu atribuíste um papel para analogia retórica para essa distinção, e a minha pergunta enfim, que imediatamente me parece que essa é uma distinção lógica, mas, enfim, queria saber um pouco, se tu pudesse explicar esse ponto novamente. Obrigada.
Bom, então vamos passar as respostas. Eu vou só aproveitar para complementar, já que eu ia fazer uma pergunta para as duas. A pergunta que eu ia fazer para a Luciana foi já incluída na pergunta do Joel, que era a questão da teleologia, na terceira crítica para a analogia, e para a Soraya, é no sentido também do que o Joel levantou, a Soraya. Eu fiquei muito curioso de te ouvir com relação à contribuição do cosmopolitismo, pensando em instâncias internacionais, né, tanto para a Corte Europeia, da União Europeia, de Direitos Humanos e de questões ambientais, como para a Corte Internacional de Justiça, como você veria em termos assim factíveis, né, que possam ser realizados essa contribuição com relação ao meio ambiente, porque eu acho que você citou até o Humboldt, foi uma questão que o professor Christoph Horn também trouxe aqui sobre a Kant. O Kant parece trazer essa inovação do cosmos no cosmopolitismo, né, que já havia esse termo de origem estoica, mas com essa dimensão também de mundo, né, Welt, porque ele tem uma Weltphilosophie. Então, a ideia de, de ambientalismo tem agora um poder muito forte para lembrar a todos os estados e todos os habitantes deste planeta que temos que cuidar do planeta. Então, eu fiquei curioso de saber como é que você veria, em termos pragmáticos, atuações junto, por exemplo, à União Europeia e à Corte Internacional de Justiça. Muito obrigado. Então, Luciana, podes iniciar.
Obrigada, fico muito grata pelas perguntas. Vou começar pela pergunta da professora Mitielli. Estou muito contente em te conhecer, aí te mandei uma mensagem privada, porque justo esse ano eu vi um trabalho seu e gostei muito dele. Não, a questão comecei por essa pergunta porque eu acho que foi uma coisa que eu falei bem no início, logo no início, e que é uma coisa bem difícil de justificar do meu trabalho. Eu acho que Kant, que na obra de Kant podemos diferenciar pelo menos três noções de analogia que são muito diferentes. E que, segundo a minha hipótese, nós podemos encontrar as origens dessas três noções de analogia em três disciplinas diferentes que Kant recupera e reformula. E essas disciplinas são a matemática, na qual a analogia é apresentada como uma identidade entre duas proporções, a equivalência entre duas proporções. E eu acho que essa noção de analogia é importante para compreender a noção de analogia que aparece na primeira crítica. A noção lógica de analogia, que é um tipo de inferência não dedutiva, e que nos textos lógicos aparece como um tipo de inferência que não é próprio da razão, senão do juízo, da faculdade de julgar. E eu acho que esse segundo tipo de analogia teria que ser o que permite compreender os usos do conceito de analogia na terceira crítica, na crítica do juízo. E um terceiro sentido de analogia, que é mais de sentido comum, que é um conceito que a gente usa de analogia no âmbito da retórica, que é a ideia de que a analogia é uma relação entre duas coisas que são parecidas, mas que não têm uma conexão de fato, E essa conexão entre duas coisas tem diferentes formas. A forma mais simples é a metáfora e a forma mais complexa é a analogia. Eu usei a palavra analogia retórica para dizer que eu pego esse conceito de analogia do âmbito das figuras retóricas, que eu entendo a analogia como uma figura retórica que permite compreender como é que se apresenta ou se introduz um conceito através de uma relação arbitrária com outras ideias. No caso que eu li, o conceito que Kant intenta compreender é o conceito do erro, e ele, para isso, utiliza uma analogia com a física, como um modo como nós compreendemos o movimento circular na física, como uma composição entre duas forças que têm duas direções diferentes. Aí a resultante que faz com que o movimento seja circular é compreendido como um vector resultante cujos elementos podemos analisar a partir da descomposição deles. No mesmo sentido, nós poderíamos entender o erro a partir da descomposição dos elementos, o erro nos juízos, a partir da descomposição dos elementos que constituem o juízo, que são os elementos que proporcionam a sensibilidade e o entendimento. Nessa passagem, o que Kant quer justificar é que o erro não tem sua origem nem na sensibilidade pura, nem na sensibilidade isolada, nem no entendimento isolado, senão no julgamento mesmo. É por isso que eu usei a palavra retórica. Não porque eu acho que o problema seja um problema meramente retórico, mas porque eu acho que o sentido de analogia que é relevante para compreender essa estratégia kantiana para apresentar o conceito é aquele conceito de analogia que nós temos quando fazemos uma lista das figuras retóricas. Só isso. Não sei se... Depois tem as perguntas da professora Silvia e do professor Joel. Na pergunta da professora Silvia, sim, eu acho que seria bastante interessante ver, não sei se tanto, sim, eu acho que seria interessante ver se podemos estender a analogia que Kant introduz para pensar como é que surgem as diferentes tipos de ilusões. O problema é que eu ainda não estabeleci um passo anterior que eu acho que é importante, que é passar do conceito do erro para o conceito de ilusão. Eu acho que ainda para explicar o conceito de ilusão, Kant tem que fazer uma retórica bastante mais complexa, porque ainda tem que explicar mesmo o conceito de ilusão, tem que explicar a origem da ilusão e tem que explicar os diferentes tipos de ilusões. E aí eu acho que quando Kant passa do conceito do erro para o conceito da ilusão, a situação fica bastante mais complexa, porque a ilusão que lhe interessa não é apenas a ilusão empírica ou a ilusão lógica, mas a ilusão transcendental. Aí eu acho que para pensar por meio da analogia física, que é a analogia que está sendo utilizada nessa passagem, os diferentes tipos de ilusões que acontecem no uso da razão, eu acho que seria bem interessante ver quais são os outros elementos envolvidos na complexidade do conceito mesmo de ilusão transcendental, que é bastante mais complexo no meu modo de ver do que o conceito de erro, que o conceito introduzido na passagem. Mas acho realmente que a pergunta é muito interessante e, honestamente, para mim, eu não estudei, eu ainda não tenho estudado muito em detalhe as diferentes passagens da dialética transcendental, que eu acho que é a parte mais importante da crítica da razão pura. Eu acho que é a parte mais interessante e é o núcleo mesmo da crítica da razão pura. E para mim fica bastante difícil compreender como se vincula essa noção de erro que aparece na passagem que eu apresentei com o problema da lógica própria e da máxima própria da razão, que é o fundamento pelo qual a razão genera os conceitos que são as ideias. Ou seja, eu acho que realmente tem, além do problema do erro e da relação, da intromissão ou da confusão entre a estética, a sensibilidade e a capacidade de pensar, além disso, tem um problema que eu acho ainda mais, para mim, é ainda mais complexo e mais difícil, da lógica própria da razão, que tem a máxima de totalidade. Eu acho que aí aparece um problema lógico adicional que teria que ser incorporado nesse intento de pensar a passagem do conceito do erro para o conceito dos diferentes tipos de ilusões. Mas fico muito grata pela pergunta e realmente vou pensar ainda mais nela. E as perguntas do professor Joel, que são as perguntas acerca, primeiro, das diferenças, se tem alguma diferença entre o conceito de analogia lógica, que eu chamei de lógica, que não é lógica, é lógico, é transcendental, mas o conceito de analogia que aparece na estética, ou que é relevante na estética, no sentido do juízo estético, e a que aparece na teleologia. E nesse ponto, eu preciso confessar que, para mim, a parte mais difícil da minha tarefa, que é de explicar esses três conceitos de analogia, é precisamente compreender como Kant recupera e compreende a noção de analogia lógica, que, no meu modo de ver, teria que ser recuperado na terça crítica, porque é precisamente o tipo de procedimento próprio da faculdade de julgar, reflexionante, segundo o corpus lógico. Então, seria quase óbvio que o conceito de analogia relevante para compreender a análise da faculdade de julgar no seu uso reflexionante teria que ser precisamente a lógica. Mas tem momentos nos quais eu não fico tão certa que a diferença entre o uso lógico e o uso matemático de analogias fica tão clara no caso da terceira crítica e na redefinição da analogia que aparece na terceira crítica. Por isso, eu acho que fica ainda mais complexo compreender, primeiro, se tem um conceito de analogia único que recorre à terceira crítica, e se o conceito que aparece na análise do conceito do conhecimento simbólico, etc., é o mesmo que aparece já quando Kant desenvolve o problema do conhecimento de Deus na segunda parte da crítica do juízo. Eu, sinceramente, não sei, porque ainda não fiz essa parte da minha pesquisa, se o conceito que Kant formula de analogia na terceira crítica é uniforme, se é o mesmo ao longo do texto, e não tenho certeza de que, de fato, como falei rapidamente, corresponda ao que eu denominei o uso lógico das analogias. Então, a resposta da primeira pergunta do professor Joe é não sei. E a segunda pergunta tinha a ver com como aparece o conceito de sensibilidade na passagem que eu apresentei. E é verdade que quando eu falei, eu apresentei o conceito de sensibilidade no sentido que aparece na estética transcendental quando nós isolamos a mera receptividade e procuramos compreender as representações a priori envolvidas na nossa receptividade. Só que nessa passagem, e por isso eu acho que o senhor tem razão, aparecem algumas coisas que são um pouco esquisitas, que não parecem concordar precisamente com essa ideia de mera passividade que aparece na estética transcendental. Como, por exemplo, o fato de que ela seja apresentada como uma força, uma craft, o fato de que ele fale uma ação que ela realiza, a sensibilidade a sensibilidade estética não faz nenhuma ação. Eu não sei se seria correto chamar ela de capas de força, e além disso, de pensar que ela é capaz de fazer alguma atividade. Então, é verdade que o conceito de sensibilidade que aparece nessa passagem, por um lado, teria que ser o conceito que aparece na estética transcendental. Teria que ser o conceito, porque o que nos interessa é lembrar que para evitar o erro nos juízos, nós temos que separar as duas componentes do juízo, e as duas componentes do juízo são a componente sensível e a componente intelectual. E é precisamente o que ele já fez na crítica da razão pura, é ver quais são as componentes do conhecimento. Mas eu concordo que realmente o vocabulário que é utilizado aqui parece envolver uma noção mais ampla da sensibilidade, na qual a sensibilidade envolve algum tipo de atividade ou de não mera passividade. Sim.
Obrigado, professora Soraya.
Obrigada pelas perguntas.
Eu preferiria continuar ouvindo a Luciana, teria até questões para ela, como a diferenciação entre ilusão, erro e o conceito de ideologia, depois, se haveria alguma relação, mas enfim, vou então tentar responder as questões. Quanto então às 5 dimensões do cosmopolitismo, ou seja, a primeira dimensão é meramente moral. A segunda dimensão, e aqui eu entro na questão do Shell, que é a institucional. A tese que eu tentei suportar é antes a tese do Polman, né, que é justamente o contrário da ideia de um Estado mundial. Ou seja, a ideia é de que uma democracia muito pequena, por mais limitada que seja, essa sim é que tem que ser cosmopolita, ou seja, a ideia da democracia cosmopolita. E não é só aqui um Estado, é qualquer tipo de comunidade política. E pode ser mesmo, como em alguns autores pensam, mesmo então cidades cosmopolitas, né, como Derrida pensou nas cidades-refúgio, e podemos até estender para qualquer tipo mesmo de comunidade, ou seja, uma comunidade política indígena que respeita os direitos humanos de todos, que segue os princípios da igualdade e da liberdade, que respeita o meio ambiente, o que significa que respeita, então, as futuras gerações. Então, uma comunidade indígena assim, ela pode ser muito mais cosmopolita do que qualquer outro tipo de instituição. Então, né, respondendo diretamente a sua pergunta, não é questão aqui de Estado mundial, nada disso. A questão é justamente o contrário, é pensar o cosmopolitismo como um princípio fundamental de qualquer tipo de comunidade política, por menor que seja. Na terceira dimensão do cosmopolitismo, que é então das associações transfronteiriças, também é o contrário de um Estado mundial, porque seria então formas de associações extraparlamentares, transfronteiriças, e se quiser, alguns autores usam a expressão, em vez de um cosmopolitismo que viria de cima para baixo, um cosmopolitismo que viria de baixo para cima, porque o que importa aqui, né, é o contrário no Estado mundial, seria então os cidadãos, então aqui mesmo, como poder constituinte, que reivindicariam direitos cosmopolitas e a extensão desses direitos de todos. E na quarta dimensão, que seria então a parte jurídica, também essa parte jurídica não precisaria, de um modo algum, de um Estado mundial. Ora, os exemplos, então, que existem já de instituições jurídicas que podem ser ditas que são cosmopolitas, porque já não podem mais ser pensadas em termos de direito internacional, então são aquelas que comportam a possibilidade de direitos e obrigações individuais e não de estados. Ora, a Corte Internacional de Justiça, ela, que é o órgão judicial da ONU, ela tem a forma Estado contra Estado, ou seja, os processos são do tipo Camarões contra Nigéria, Estado contra Estado. Já a Corte Internacional, desculpa, a Corte Europeia de Direitos Humanos, os processos têm a forma Maria contra Portugal. Mesmo na Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, também Maria da Penha contra o Brasil, ou seja, um indivíduo contra o Estado. E a Corte Penal Internacional também tem a forma da responsabilidade individual, ou seja, é o procurador contra Lubanga, não é o procurador contra um indivíduo que tem a responsabilidade. O paradoxo que surge aqui é que há petição individual em relação a direitos humanos, mas responsabilidade coletiva quando há violação dos direitos humanos, ou seja, é Maria contra Portugal e não Maria contra um outro indivíduo. Mas há responsabilidade individual apenas nos crimes internacionais, ou seja, genocídio, crimes contra a humanidade, crimes de guerra e o ataque de um Estado contra o outro, né, quando é reconhecido. Então, aqui nesse caso, no caso desses crimes internacionais que foram reconhecidos, e outros crimes internacionais que não estão na jurisdição da Corte Internacional Penal, mas que podem ser também objeto de jurisdição universal, por exemplo. Então, no caso desses crimes, há responsabilidade individual. E isso é uma invenção kantiana, quando ele pensa no direito cosmopolita, e os exemplos que ele dá são exemplos do que é hoje, né, chamado de o direito da guerra, o que era antes o direito humanitário, ou seja, os crimes cometidos durante a guerra, e os exemplos que o Kant dá são exatamente esses, ligados, então, à colonização, né, dentro da questão, como considerar aquelas atrocidades que estavam acontecendo como crimes se não havia aqui tratados entre os estados. Bom, mas aí então se considera o indivíduo como cidadão do mundo. Juridicamente, isso faz parte hoje dessas recentes invenções jurídico-políticas que há na Corte Penal Internacional, no Tribunal Europeu de Direitos Humanos e na Corte Interamericana de Direitos Humanos, né, com esse paradoxo de que há a responsabilidade coletiva quando há violação de direitos humanos, né, e por isso alguns autores reivindicam mesmo a necessidade da existência de uma corte internacional de direitos humanos, onde haja também responsabilidade individual. Então, não há aqui também necessidade de um Estado mundial, como a Corte Penal Internacional não precisa de um Estado mundial, e, né, se um dia viermos a ter, espero que venhamos a ter uma Corte Internacional de Direitos Humanos, também não precisaria de um Estado mundial, ou seja, seria antes no modelo da Corte Penal Internacional. Entrando, ou seja, né, nessas três dimensões, na institucional, que foi a segunda dimensão, na propriamente política e cidadania na terceira dimensão, e na quarta dimensão do direito cosmopolita, nenhum dos três precisa de um Estado mundial. Então, né, apesar disso ser muito recorrente, enfim, nesses debates, eu não entro nessa questão, e os mecanismos jurídicos e políticos e as formas que eu encontro, que eu consigo encontrar no Kant, e que os autores também, enfim, consideram como sendo reais hoje existentes, nenhum deles, então, precisaria de um Estado mundial. Entrando agora na questão do Nitamar, que seria então a quinta dimensão, que seria o cosmocentrismo. Então, sim, eu penso, né, tanto como, e tento encontrar isso no Kant, e depois o Alexander von Humboldt, ele reconstrói isso a partir do Kant, ou seja, para o Alexander von Humboldt, os estudos do Kant sobre a natureza vão ser fundamentais para a compreensão do cosmos, do próprio Alexander von Humboldt, mas do cosmopolitismo e dessa concepção da humanidade, de conceber também a humanidade dentro da história do cosmos, né? E todas as implicações políticas, éticas e estéticas que isso teria. E entrando então na parte que o Nitamara pensou, nos mecanismos jurídicos. E sim, eu entro então agora volto para a quarta dimensão. O que muitos autores reivindicam é a responsabilidade individual e não sei se a melhor instância seria a Corte Internacional de Justiça, porque, como eu disse, que trabalha na forma ainda, né, de Estado contra Estado, e haveria aqui necessidade de uma expansão do que já existe na Corte do Direito Internacional do Mar. Ou seja, a Corte Internacional do Direito do Mar já tem aqui uma grande ambição de proteger o meio ambiente. E aqui o que alguns autores aqui vão reivindicar, e assim como a Corte Internacional Penal para os Crimes Internacionais, uma nova corte, ou a extensão das cortes existentes para os crimes contra o meio ambiente e para a responsabilização individual e responsabilização de indivíduos, responsabilização de empresas, e mesmo que haja aqui, então, dirigentes de estados, não são os estados que seriam condenados, né? Como já existe em algumas instâncias, enfim, não. Mas a responsabilização individual aparece como uma exigência aqui fundamental para o avanço civilizacional da proteção do meio ambiente, né? Assim como também seria para a proteção dos direitos humanos e como é atualmente para os crimes internacionais. Ou seja, a responsabilidade individual aqui seria fundamental.
Muito obrigado, Soraya. Muito obrigado, Luciana. Eu creio que estamos com um horário bastante avançado e aqui no Brasil já é o horário do almoço, então ficou combinado que às 14 horas nós devemos retomar para a última sessão do Colóquio Internacional Kant. Então, mais uma vez, agradecer a todas e todos, particularmente a Soraya e a Luciana, pelas excelentes apresentações, e retomamos os trabalhos às 14 horas. Muito obrigado, até mais.
Então, infelizmente, eu não
Sim.
vou poder participar à tarde, porque tenho uma consulta médica que eu não consegui adiar.
Claro,
Então,
não,
desculpe por esclarecer à
entendemos.
tarde, mas eu
Entendemos.
preciso realmente hoje. Até mais.
Nice to see you, Ed. You should be giving a talk on Kant's third critique.
Yeah, yeah. That would be in line, yes.
Yeah. Well, nice to see you, Soraya. How's everything? Are you in Portugal right now or in Germany?
Olha, eu estou agora num gabinete da biblioteca da Faculdade de Direito em Oxford, porque eu estou no meu
Em
sabático
Oxford. Aham.
e estou aqui, tive reunião até a 1h30, vim para cá, para o gabinete, correndo para participar do colóquio, e agora já começou, aliás, estamos esperando a defesa de um projeto de tese de um orientando meu, que começaria, né, 9 minutos atrás, enfim, deve estar me esperando
Ok.
isso também, que eu não vou poder participar.
Bom, muito obrigado. Então, um
Olha,
abraço, pessoal. Tchau,
Olha, um
tchau.
abraço, um abraço.
Tchau, tchau.